The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And we're really blessed to have with us Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. And this is part 2 of Babylon's Banksters. We left off the last time talking about the Tower of Babel. And let's go into that just a little bit to recap, Joseph.
Well, the Tower of Babel, I view as kind of a myth in the proper sense. In other words, there is a universal truth in it. And by saying I view it as a myth, I don't mean to say that I view it as something that didn't really happen.
Yes.
But I mean to give it a quality that applies to something universal within mankind, and that is this desire on the part of a few to use whatever means possible that they have to establish a hegemony over the rest of us. And in the way that I've been interpreting it, from the Giza Death Star destroyed on through cosmic war, and then on into Babylon's Banksters and the new book, which incidentally I should make an announcement tonight.
Yes.
The new book is at the publisher, not the one I'm working on now that I'm not talking about, but the one I finished about 2 months ago. That is at the publisher. It will be published by Farrell House, and the title of that book is called Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men.
Oh.
Yeah. And I have to warn people ahead of time, particularly those of a religious bent. There's much in it that they probably are not going to like. But I covered certain things simply because I think that these issues need to be brought out into the open and exposed, and the apologetic problems dealt with appropriately, which brings us back to the Tower of Babel.
Yes.
Because if you read the story, my view or my interpretation of the story is that what you really have going on there is a struggle for power. There's not really a morality involved in the way that the story is recorded in the Bible. It's just that mankind, if he completes this project, whatever it represents, will be able to do whatsoever he imagines to do.
Yes.
And I view the tower as encompassing two things in order to establish this hegemony. And the first we've already talked about through many of the series, Cosmic War and previously in this Babylon's Banksters series. I view it in part as an attempt in ancient times to recover and restore the lost physics that had, and the technology that went with it, that had been there and present in that ancient very high civilization that preceded the Mesopotamian civilizations. In other words, for want of a better word, Atlantis.
Yes.
But, I tend to avoid that term because it's very laden with associations and connotations and so on that I don't particularly want to employ. But basically, a pre-existing high civilization. But the other thing that I think is involved, as I've tried to outline in Babylon's Banksters, this physics has implications for financial policy, for economics.
Yes.
Because when you read Babylon's Banksters, what I'm trying to do is show people that the economic systems of the world and the physical systems of the world, the physics that are believed, that are taught, go hand in hand with each other. If you have one type of physics, you're going to have a certain type of economic and fiscal policy. If you have another type of physics, you're going to have a very different one.
Yes.
So I think that in that sense, the Tower of Babel represents an attempt to also impose or to compel a certain type of economic system. And again, the title of the book, Babylon's Banksters, kind of is a clue of where I think the basic tenets and outlines of modern monopoly banking began. So that's basically what, I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes.
I'm kind of going around Harvey's barn, as I usually do. But that's kind of the way I view the tower.
Well, that is, people say, well, they committed a sin. Well, they were never told not to build the tower to begin with.
Yeah.
So there is no sin involved.
Yeah, well, that's the way I read it. There's no indignation, there's no divine wrath or anything, but really what's at stake here, if you read it without the pious lenses that people are taught to read that story with, in Sunday school and in the pulpit and by the churches and so on, if you free yourself from those perspectives, it's simply a political commentary. Yeah. For want of a better expression.
Yes, it is. Well, let's pick up on part 2. Astrology. The Grand Cross. All these things, the Depression of 1870, creating something out of nothing. How did they use astrology to do this?
Well, this is a very complicated question, and again, I'm going to have to go around Harvey's barn to answer.
That's okay.
Let's begin with what astrology really was and what claims were made for it back in ancient times. And of course, the roots of modern Western astrology go back once again to Babylon. There are a set of tablets, cuneiform tablets, literally thousands of them, that are called the Omen Tablets, and they're nothing but tablets of astronomical observation, astrological prediction, and so on and so forth. When you read these things, the claim is made in them that these observations were compiled for tens of thousands of years. In other words, what they're telling you, what they're claiming, is that that astrology is a legacy from that pre-existing high civilization in which it actually represented a formal science.
Yes.
And what astrology then became was a very declined legacy from that. It falls into the cracks between science and superstition. The ancient practice of astrology was to cast a horoscope for a king, okay?
Yes.
Now, effectively, what this means is that astrology in ancient times was something very, very different than what we think of when we go through the grocery line supermarket checkout stand and we see all these little sun sign books in the aisles, for sale.
Yeah.
Because what they were not concerned with was the individual. They were concerned with the king. In other words, with casting a mundane horoscope for a particular nation, for a particular group of people. Okay? Now, this is the key to the physics involved, in my opinion, because what this means is that there is a direct analog to modern physics. In quantum mechanics, for example, you cannot predict the behavior of an individual particle, okay?
Yes.
But you can predict a statistical behavior pattern of a bunch of particles, all right?
Oh, yes.
So in other words, what ancient astrology did was it was not talking so much about an individual. It was talking about an aggregate influence of planetary geometries on an aggregate group of people. So in other words, this claim in the Omen Tablets that it was based on observation, well, that's the very bedrock of science, empirical observation. So I think to bring it up to modern times and to begin to answer your question, the Great Depressions that this country has suffered in its 200-plus years history have always been accompanied at those times by an astrological formation called the Grand Cross, when certain planets are clustered at 90 degrees opposition from each other. So in other words, you'd have planetary positions at 90 degrees, at 180 degrees, at 270 degrees, and so on around the circle. And the Grand Cross formation has occurred at each of those points in this nation's history where there has been a Great Depression. Now, let's go a little bit further. We talked, I think, the last time about cycles and Edward Dewey's Foundation for the Study of Cycles.
Yes.
And his discovery that all economic activity, whatsoever it may be, in fact, all human social activity, in fact, all activity, period, was clustered around waveforms and cycles. And let's throw into the mix another little phenomenon. In the early 1950s, no less than the RCA Corporation hired one of its engineers to do a study of why shortwave radio propagation signals were variable over time. And of course, the usual explanation was sunspots. Well, this guy dug a little deeper, and I put these charts, as you know, in Babylon's Banksters.
Yes.
What he discovered was that radio signal strength, radio signal propagation varied over time, and it varied with the position of certain planets relative to each other, namely the large gas giants in the outer solar system. And he discovered when these planets were in exactly 90 degrees of opposition to each other. In other words, the planets are at 90 and 180 and 270 degrees. And you look at these charts that he drew for the RCA Corporation, and they look everything like astrological charts. So in other words, there is a physics to this that we're just beginning to rediscover. All right? Now, I think the short answer then to your question is that it is my opinion that certain very wealthy, very powerful families have known this for a long time. Now, they're not using this knowledge to create certain conditions, because in a certain sense, again, what we're dealing with are conditions that lead to statistical aggregates of behavior.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So in other words, there is a certain overall inevitability to these cycles. It's part of the physics. In other words, we can no more stop it than we can stop the law of gravity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what they can do is, knowing that certain cycles are going to be in a trend upward or downward at particular times, they can pursue policies depending on what their goals may be at the time.
Right.
They can pursue policies to exacerbate or ameliorate the trend of those cycles. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So, for example, if you are in a downturn and you pursue a policy that is going to explode things even more, that's going to make the net result even worse. Okay?
Yeah.
And by the same token, if you pursue the opposite policy, it's going to damp the effect of the cycle. Now, I found it very interesting, and I hope that answers your question, but let me add just one more thing. I found it very interesting that one of the major Japanese banking houses, Mitsubishi Bank, had an economist that is a member of this Foundation for the Study of Cycles. And, you know, that's probably the tip of the iceberg. That's the only bank that I know of that was represented in this foundation, but I'm sure that there's probably others. And this, to me, indicates that at a very high and deep level within the corporate elite, there is knowledge of this sort of statistical pattern over time, and that they can tailor their policies accordingly. Yeah, that's a ho-ho.
Yeah. Oh, my. They won't give up until they have control of everything.
Well, they're certainly trying, but, the key to this is, again, the physics. This is why I think you find the same corporations, the same bankers, the same people are involved in suppressing a certain aspect of physics.
Yes.
And at the same time are busily pursuing it off the books and for themselves.
Oh, yes. Well, moving back in time, there's this grid work of temples and pyramids.
Yes.
And Sanderson...
Ivan Sanderson.
Yeah, he did some very interesting work on that.
Yes, he did. He was probably, for people who don't know who Ivan Sanderson was, some of your older listeners might remember him appearing on occasion on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He was a zoologist, and he would, on the Carson Show, he would always bring in these very strange animals, and display them for Carson. But he was a legitimate scientist, but he had a kind of a hobby, and his hobby was investigation of paranormal things, off the beaten track sorts of things.
Yeah.
He was one of the first early scholarly authors about UFOs and USOs, unidentified submarine objects. He was the first to show an interest in the grid that apparently existed on the globe, on the placement of some of these ancient sites. So Sanderson, if you're into this type of research, Sanderson is one of the crucial figures that you'll encounter, because he was one of the earliest people to be writing about these things and doing so in a non-frivolous way. Well, he discovered that there was indeed a pattern to, if you superimposed these ancient sites, Teotihuacan, Tikal, Machu Picchu, Giza, if you imposed these sites on a grid of the world, you would discover that they were all in similar latitudes, similar longitudes. They were in certain spots on the world. Now, I think what we're dealing with, eventually I'm hoping at some point to explore the whole subject of the grid in a book.
Yes.
Because I think it has not been given the kind of in-depth attention it needs to be given.
Yes.
But my intuition is that what we're looking at are the nodal points or intersections of standing surface waves, and let me explain what I mean. Let's go back to our template analogy that we used way back in Cosmic War.
Yeah.
If we're standing at the shore of a very smooth pond with a handful of pebbles, and we throw the pebbles up in the air and let them come down on the water, each little rock is going to create a set of waves. And as the waves intersect, they're going to create a kind of a grid pattern on the surface of the water, right?
Okay.
Now, let's imagine the Earth as our pond, the surface of the Earth. And the Earth is set into vibration somehow. Well, you're going to have these rippling waves on the surface of the Earth, and where they intersect, you're going to have an area of relative stillness. There's going to be lots of energy there.
Yeah.
But it's going to appear rather still, okay?
Okay.
That, I think, is what we're looking at with these temple placements in some cases. I think that they were deliberately set over a nodal point where the interferometry cancels out, and you have basically an area of no wave activity, but a lot of stress. In other words, there's a lot of energy that can be accessed at those particular points. So again, I think what we're looking at, to make the long answer short finally, you know me, I can't shut up, but I think what we're looking at is a residue of knowledge of this very sophisticated physics that once existed and it was once tapped into. I think that's what you're looking at.
And then there was Nikolai
Tesla.
Nikolai Goncharow.
Kozyrev, you mean?
Yeah.
The Soviet physicist.
Yes.
Yes, well, that's Kozyrev. Well, Kozyrev, I talk about him largely in The Philosopher's Stone, but I do mention him again in Babylon's Banksters, because Kozyrev was actually a relatively famous astrophysicist, well known internationally.
Yeah.
Kozyrev had an interesting theory. He discovered in the 50s that the sun, which according to general relativity is, nothing but a big chained-up hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
And in that noddle should be spitting out X number of neutrinos, okay?
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, the sun isn't spitting out X number of neutrinos. In fact, it's far too low. And this has always puzzled scientists, astrophysicists. Well, Kozyrev just came right out and said, well, if this is the case, then there is another source of energy other than thermonuclear fusion in the sun. Okay?
Yes.
And what he speculated was that the sun, by simply rotating a plasma, that's all it is a big, huge rotating plasma that's under stress of some sort, that this was gating energy from higher dimensional sources. And in his opinion, the ultimate source of this energy was time itself, okay? Or if you prefer the word torsion, all right?
Yes.
Well, Kozyrev, once he said that, he started to set up a series of experiments, and bang, immediately the man was denounced as kind of a fraud and a mountebank in Pravda, okay?
Oh, my gosh.
Okay? But that's not the end of the story. What really happened was that Kozyrev's work became some of the most highly classified research being done in the Soviet Union.
Oh my gosh!
And he was doing this almost up to the day he died. I think that was in the 80s, and we didn't even find out that he had been doing this for the Soviet Union under such extreme classification for so long, until the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, and then it finally came out. Well, Kozyrev set up a series of experiments, and I describe them in The Philosopher's Stone, a little bit in Babylon's Banksters, involving very finely balanced, delicate balances with gyroscopes and so on and so forth. And he performed various experiments with the rotation of the gyroscopes in this configuration and that configuration. And what he discovered in all of these experiments was that he would get different results depending not only upon where he performed the experiment on the surface of the Earth, but when. Okay?
Oh, boy.
So, he'd get things, he would get variable masses of things that he was trying to weigh over time, and the variability would be consistent with the season of the year and the planetary positions and so on and so forth. So, in other words, he began by trying to explain an anomaly with the sun's output of energy. And let's go back to something else I said.
Okay.
If you recall back in the Cosmic War, I said that when we set off our first hydrogen bomb, the yield that we had calculated for it was about 4 to 6 megatons, but it ran away to 10.
Yes.
So in other words, they had miscalculated by a whopping 4 million tons of the explosive power of TNT. This is not a small error.
Oh boy.
So I think that what actually happened was they realized, particularly in the Soviet Union, when they set off their first hydrogen bomb, they probably got a similar result. They probably calculated for a particular yield and got far more out of it than they were expecting. Well, along comes Kozyrev, and he's saying essentially the same thing about the sun, you see.
Yes.
And this, I think, is why his work went deeply black in the Soviet Union. Because effectively what he's saying is that the very position, the timing, the geometry of local celestial space has an influence, a subtle influence,
yes,
on the amount of energy that systems produce. It has a very subtle influence on the behavior of systems in the aggregate. And of course, once we've said that, we're right back to what we've said about astrology.
yes,
There is a deep physics basis for the behavior of any system in the aggregate, and I include within the word system human systems.
yes.
Okay? So this is what we're dealing with.
Oh. Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Well, then comes Bill Becker, and Bethy Hagens, and they expanded on an article about the grid over the Earth.
Yes.
The Buckminster Fuller.
Buckminster Fuller.
Yes.
Well, let me explain what Buckminster Fuller did and what the Huygens did. The Buckminster Fuller was if your listeners don't know who he is, he's a fascinating person to do a little research on, because he was a scientist, but he was definitely an out-of-the-box thinker.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the things that he did, one of the experiments I just love that he did, was he took a bunch of balloons, filled them up with air, and then painted the surfaces of the balloons with paint, okay?
Yeah.
And then he submerged the balloons in tanks of water and then bombarded the balloons with ultrasound, okay? So that what happened when he did this was, he'd try different patterns of interference of sound on these balloons. And he discovered that on the surface of these balloons, what would happen is that there would be a standing wave that would be set up inside the balloon, and it would affect the surface, the rubber surface of the balloon, and it would make the paint coagulate into these patterns of a grid, nodes of intersection and then lines and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And he could vary these patterns depending on the frequencies and the way that the waves were mixed and so on and so forth. So in other words, what he's demonstrating is that the grid system of the Earth is based on what I said before, on a pattern of interference of these waves, just like our rocks in the pond. Now the Huygens come along, and they basically come to the same conclusion that if you look at this grid work, effectively what you're looking at is a gigantic crystal. In other words, the grid system of the Earth actually functions to make the Earth, the planet itself, a huge, huge crystal, a lattice work.
Oh my.
Yeah, oh my. So, we're all the way back to cosmic war, we're all the way back to the Great Pyramid, and how it's placed and what it is, because most people don't realize what it is. It's a huge crystal.
Yes.
The angle of the slope of the Great Pyramid, 51 degrees, 51 minutes, and I forget how many seconds. Well, if you look at the angle of that slope, that is the angle of a natural quartz crystal at its point.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And what is the pyramid made out of? Well, limestone and granite.
Yes.
And of course granite has zillions of tiny little quartz crystals embedded in it, and as does limestone to a certain extent. So in other words, you're looking at a crystalline structure. It's designed as a crystal. It's at a particular crystalline angle, and it's full of tiny little crystals.
Yes.
and it's positioned on a particular point on this Earth grid, which, again, following the grid theory, you're dealing with a huge crystal. So yeah, it's all endlessly fascinating, and again, I think that the placement of some of these ancient sites at particular places means that we're dealing with a residue of a physics. And incidentally, I want to point out that in the new book, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I start out kind of picking up on that precise point and what was going on after the Cosmic War and who was doing it and why they were doing it. So, the story's not over.
Yeah. Well, the Nazis were the first to be interested in the Earth's grid system.
Yes, well, the Nazi Germany is, again, where the modern nation state, the first world power that shows a major interest in trying to understand the basis behind all of this ancient lore and all of these ancient phenomena. Now, let's grant the fact that the Nazis were utterly, totally insane.
Yeah.
And that much of what happened inside of Nazi Germany in the name of science was just nothing but quackery. There's no other word for it. But by the same token, as I said long time ago in these lectures, if you create a climate of opinion a bureaucratic climate where you are required to think outside the box, you are going to have more failures than successes by far. But the successes, when they come, will be palpable, and they will be revolutionary and breathtaking, and therefore you're not very likely to hear much about them. We do know from the Bell Project that they had a lot of breakthroughs in some very arcane areas. So I think their interest in the grid theory, while they may never have made any significant breakthroughs in it, at least it's interesting to me that you have a great power investing the time and money to look into it and to try and understand it. And I think probably that research has continued very, very secretly. And again, I would point to Kozyrev as the example of that. We know that something along those lines was done in the former Soviet Union.
Well, then we have Dr. Konstantin Mile that wrote a 600-plus page book, Temples as Transmitters.
Yes. That is one of the really, to me, bizarre things, because Professor Dr. Mile, which means, in the formal German address, that means he's actually a professor.
Yes.
Okay? He's teaching. So this is not a fly-by-night, okay?
Right.
Well, this man wrote a book called Scalar Waves, and it's nothing but a treatise of mathematical physics. That's all it is. Yeah. And being interested in this sort of stuff, I send off to Germany for the book, and here it comes in the mail, and I sit down and start reading this. And at the very end of the book, my jaw just hits the floor because this guy says, well, let's pose a problem here. He says, let's pretend we're ancient engineers, and we're going to try and figure out what engineers call the optimalization problem. How are we going to send, with a minimum of power, how are we going to send radio signals around the world?
Yes.
Well, he says, the way... I'm reading this and I'm thinking, well, of course, it's rather obvious, but you just have to look at these things in a certain way.
Yeah.
You have to look at these things with an engineer's eye and not the eye of all the nonsense that they tell you in ancient history classes.
Yes.
You look at these temples, says Dr. Mile, these ancient Greek temples, Roman temples, and so on and so forth. Well, they're all constructed as tuned cavities, okay?
Yeah.
They're all constructed to be resonant to a certain frequency in the radio range of the electromagnetic spectrum, okay? Which to me is, it's just really cool.
Yes.
And then he says, okay, how are we going to power this stuff? Well, he comes to the conclusion that we're powering it off of the energy either of the Earth or of the Sun, and that the signals that these things produce are very, very weak. But the thing that really caught my eye in the book is he points out, and I mention all of this in Babylon's Banksters, he points out that the classical authors, you'll find references in some of them, Roman generals would send to Rome, to the emperor, what do we do about such and such? And the emperor would respond, that night.
Yes. Very interesting.
Very, very interesting. Well, the standard response of academic history has been, well, the Romans weren't too keen on a very good sense of time.
Oh, dear.
Or, this sort of nonsense. Or that they had a system of fire and semaphore signals, throughout the empire, and so on and so forth, of course. But what Mile is showing is when they say that they sent to the emperor and received a response that night, they meant it.
Yes. Amazing.
Because you've got these temples that are sending very weak radio signals. Now, here's another cool thing that he says that this kind of floored me. If you're going to transmit by very weak power.
Yes.
And shortwave, then the best and most optimal way to transmit would be by telegraphy. In other words, think of Morse code, pulses,
Yeah.
And, of course, in order to read the signals, you're going to have very sensitive membranes. And this, in his opinion, is why you have these temples so often associated with the practice of soothsaying.
Oh.
Of, slaughtering an animal and reading their entrails.
Oh, dear.
Because, again, this is a very sensitive membrane.
Yes.
And the slaughtering took place on altars inside these, radio frequency resonant temples.
Sort of the Holy of Holies.
Sort of the Holy of Holies,
yes.
right. Now, I found all this very interesting because the other thing about these temples, as I show in Babylon's Banksters, is that they are closely associated with the bankers of the day. In fact, if you wanted to find a banker at that time, you found him in the temple.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that the temples were more or less in charge of the issuance of money.
Yeah.
Okay? So, to me, it's very interesting. If you're going to have an international coordinated economic policy back then, you've got to have some means of communicating across the globe at something faster than Pony Express, speeds, and something faster than sending fire signals and smoke signals.
Very primitive,
Yeah. And to me, Dr. Mile answers the question admirably, simply by approaching these ancient temples with the eye of an engineer and saying, well, looky here, this is resonant to this frequency, and that temple's resonant to that one, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, there are some plates in the book of temples that are fascinating.
Yes.
Just fascinating.
Yeah, I reproduce some of Dr. Miles' diagrams and so on, so that you can actually see his calculations and what he's doing. Yes, it is fascinating. And the other fascinating thing is some of the Roman temples, as he points out, look very much like the modern device of a magnetron.
Oh my gosh.
Which is another piece of very sophisticated recent technology. It emerged during World War II. And to find the same sort of geometry and design in these radio resonant temples is just a little too much.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, it is fascinating.
Yes,
utterly fascinating. Okay. Professor Kenny Frank, the Rothschild Nimrod connection, from 300 BC to 300 AD, the vast majority of Romans had Greek surnames, not Latin.
Right.
90% had Oriental blood.
Right.
Okay, what does that mean?
All right. This is something that I go into in Babylon's Banksters because it's a crucial part of the connection between the ancient banking class and the modern one.
Yes.
Because what happened in Rome was when the Roman Empire expanded into the Middle East, into Mesopotamia, and absorbed those regions, many of those people were brought to Rome, to Italy, to the suburban provinces of Rome, okay, right there in Italy, as slaves.
Yes.
Okay? Now, the Roman practice of slavery was, in some respects, very similar to the Southern practice in this country before the Civil War, in that the slaves were usually those responsible for running the household, for administering the household affairs for these very wealthy Roman families, and oftentimes were responsible for the education of the family children. Okay, so in other words, these were not illiterate people by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But in addition to this, the Roman practice was, on the death of the slaveholder, many times they would subject their slaves to manumission. In other words, they'd free them. And once they were freed, then they, of course, became Roman citizens. And as a result, over time, this class of slaves eventually takes over the bureaucratic machinery of the Roman Empire. And the original Latin population of the Italian peninsula actually moves out into the provinces. Okay? So by the late Empire, what you have is the introduction of all of these very Eastern forms of religion, of administration, of government, and so on and so forth, including finance. And this is where the Roman Empire starts down the long slide into a change from state-issued currency into a debt money that's in the hands of a private monopoly.
Yes. When
the Roman Empire collapses in the West, incidentally, let's remember that the Roman Empire did not collapse in the East, okay? But when it collapses in the West, these families then in turn set up financial centers that will eventually become, one of them will be in Ravenna, which will eventually, of course, be moved to, guess where, Venice.
Yes.
And then, of course, from Venice it goes where? Well, it goes to Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And from Amsterdam it crosses the English Channel with the Glorious Revolution and ends up in England, So, in other words, you can trace a direct influence of not only the concepts that are coming from Mesopotamia of a private banking monopoly, but you can actually trace the movement of that monopoly and a certain kind of class of people that are behind it. So let's go to the Rothschilds.
Yes.
One of the things that I came across when I was researching the book was the claim made by a researcher that, in fact, the Rothschilds traced their family origin to Nimrod. So we're back to the Tower of Babel. Okay.
Yeah, big circle.
Yeah, big circle. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I could not, and let me be very clear, I could not substantiate that claim.
Yeah.
But I did find out that there have been English Rothschilds born, males, that were given the name Nimrod. So, we have present in this very Jewish family a very un-Jewish name, un-Jewish name of Nimrod in some of their male offspring. And then, okay, I thought, well, gee, that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And then I investigated a little further, and I discovered that the Rothschild group, investment group, has a fund, an investment fund, called the Nimrod Fund. And Nimrod is spelled with an E rather than an I. Okay?
Yeah.
So, there appears to be something up with that family.
Yeah.
And the name of Nimrod, we don't know exactly what, but, it's one of those things that's interesting to note in any case.
Oh, boy. They just never, they never give up. They leave little clues.
Sure.
And it's for us to put it together.
Yeah, I think
you, Joseph, you have done a splendid job of pulling information together.
Thank you.
Now we come to Michael Hayes, a British researcher, and he discovered something with the I Ching.
Well, I don't want to get too far into that because I get into it at much greater length in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, which isn't out yet.
Okay.
But the bottom line is that, how to put it without getting into too many details, what I did in Babylon's Banksters is I sort of planted the seeds for something I knew I would talk about in the next book, which is Genes, Giants, Monsters, Men. The I Ching, if you examine the details of it and compare it to the structure that is present in human DNA, the resemblance is far beyond any statistical coincidence.
Yes.
Okay? In other words, whoever constructed the I Ching as a system of divination knew a whole lot about human genetics. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me open Pandora's box just a teensy little bit further without going into too many details that I don't want to go into until the new book is actually out.
Okay.
What this means, in my opinion, and it's something I talked about way back in the Cosmic War series, and I mentioned it in the book, The Cosmic War. If you'll recall, the Tablets of Destinies were only usable when they were possessed by or in close proximity to certain people.
Yes.
Okay? I'm speculating that with the I Ching, we might have a broken off fragment of that very ancient, sophisticated science, and that we might have a broken off fragment of the Tablets of Destinies themselves. Because the way the I Ching functions, if you know anything about its system of divination, the I Ching is really kind of a very sophisticated program. It's a very, very sophisticated predictive program based on random action. So in other words, it understands that randomness is built into the system. So somebody way back when, and Fu Si is the Chinese philosopher, is the person credited with inventing the I Ching. But I don't think this is the case. I think what we have here is another little residue of a little understood technology that people simply preserved.
Yes.
Okay? And I think, again, there is another thing I should mention here. If you look at early Chinese ideograms, not the modern characters of Chinese writing, but the very, very earliest form of the ideograms, and you compare it to the earliest forms of cuneograms in cuneiform, you will be astonished at the resemblance.
Oh.
Astonished at the resemblance.
Well, we get into codons.
Mm-hmm.
What about what is a codon?
Well, let's table that for when Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men is out, because, like I say, in Babylon's Banksters, what I'm trying to do is point out that DNA has a property that allows it to transduce or interact with the physical medium itself directly, okay? Now, in saying that, what I've just told you is this is the basis for why the astrologers have always believed that astrology is an accurate science if it's predicting human behavior in the aggregate, okay? Because what you're dealing with DNA is something that is responding directly to the physical medium and interacts and interfaces with it directly. Okay?
Well, it's a natural transducer and resonator.
Yes, it's a natural resonator. Exactly. And, the helix itself, the fact that it's in a spiral form, well, there's your torsion, you see.
Yes.
You see. So, in other words, it is, as you say, just by dint of the geometry of the structure of DNA. It is by dint of that fact alone in resonance with the physical medium directly. It's a response to it, and it's also an active part of it. So, without getting into the details again and kind of waiting for Genes, Giants to come out and cap what I say in Babylon's Banksters, the reason I said what I said in Babylon's Banksters is precisely to point out to people that this is another aspect of this physics. There's a biophysics involved here.
Yes.
And it is remarkable to me that the connections, the structural, the geometric, the mathematical connections between the I Ching and DNA are so palpable.
Oh, well, some genome types are more efficient transducers or resonators than others.
Possibly.
Ah.
Possibly. Yeah, that's that's a subject again that we can get into when Gene's Giants comes out.
Okay. Well,
because we're building up the things here, folks.
Yeah.
Slowly over several books.
Yes. Well, there is a deep connection between the Human Genome Project and the Anglo-American International Bankster class.
Oh yes. Rockefeller Foundation has been a heavy backer of the Human Genome Project and so on and so forth. So certainly there is a connection there. And in my opinion, I don't have, to be very blunt and to be very honest, I do not have any evidence for what I am about to say.
Okay.
But it is my intuition. It is my deep, deep intuition and suspicion that one of the very covert and hidden and secret purposes of the project is to figure out the human clans that have a certain genotype that could more actively access some of those ancient technologies.
Yes.
And I think also they are looking to prove by some sort of scientific means the claims of certain bloodlines to be descended from the ancient gods that, came to Earth and genetically engineered man and then entered into sexual relations with certain humans and created kind of a chimerical offspring. So I think there are aspects of the project that are looking for these things, but again, I want to make very clear that is simply an intuition, nothing more. It's a suspicion, nothing more. I'm not basing it on any evidence, but in my bones I feel this very profoundly.
I think a lot of us do.
Yes, I would imagine so.
Yeah. What about Dr. Hartmut Müller?
Hartmut Müller. Oh,
yes.
Boy. He is, of course, yet another German physicist.
Yes.
We keep bumping into them.
Yes.
Because they are very good out-of-the-box thinkers. And Hartmut Müller came up with what he calls global scaling theory. And I actually really fully explore that theory in the Giza Death Star Destroyed. I only kind of summarize it in Babylon's Banksters.
Mm-hmm.
But the theory is based on something that really was first noted by a Soviet biologist who was looking over this vast amount of data that biologists had compiled. And he noticed that life forms seemed to cluster around certain areas of size. Okay? Well, along comes Hartmut Müller, and he says, oh, gee, that's a neat idea. Look at all this other stuff that we physicists have in our database. And again, he notices that certain structures, physical structures, from the very small to the very large, can be clustered around, here it comes, nodal points on waves. And in his case, what he's saying is these are waves in the physical medium itself. These are longitudinal waves. They're acoustic waves. They're areas of compression and rarefaction.
Yeah.
And where you have areas of compression is where you find physical systems clustered. Okay? Where you have areas of rarefaction, you don't tend to find as many physical systems there. Okay? Mm-hmm. Well, the Germans have taken Müller's theory even a step further. There is actually a branch of the German government that studies why cities grow where they do. And they are actually proposing kind of a modern version of the grid theory based on this physics idea that there are waves in the physical medium, standing waves on the surface of the Earth, and humans naturally tend to congregate at these places. Yeah. So again, we're back to physics. So, Hartmut Müller is yet another one of these people thinking outside the box that has his finger on a piece of this big, huge puzzle that all goes back to this idea of waves, acoustical waves in the medium itself, areas of pressure and rarefaction that are in rotation, that are always dynamic and always changing their geometry. And, once we've said that, then we're back to astrology. So it's all interconnected, and it's all based on this very, very deep hyperdimensional physics.
Boy, it's fascinating.
Oh, it's endlessly fascinating.
What if, Joseph, what if they accomplish their desires? Then what?
Well...
And what if the people refuse to cooperate?
Well, if you have figured out this physics, you can do almost, to cite the story of the Tower of Babel once again, you can do almost anything that you imagine to do. You can do everything from manipulate the weather to manipulating aggregate emotional behavior and response in human beings, and I should also point out that I talk about that aspect of things in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men.
Yes.
You would have both a technology and a technique of mind manipulation. You would have the ability, of course, if you wanted to press a button and blow up a planet,
Oh, gosh.
which is what I think actually happened once.
Yes.
So yeah, you could create and cause earthquakes with this stuff. There's any number of things. This is a very sophisticated physics, and it is such a highly unified physics that you can create a technology that can do many things, many different things, depending on how you program it with that template.
Yeah, I was going to say, with the template. And do people have any control over the programming of the template? I mean, just the ordinary people.
Sure, yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't want to get deeply into this.
Okay.
Because, excuse me, it is a very, very dangerous thing. You and I have talked privately about how dangerous it is.
Oh, yes.
But the mere fact that there is a direct link between the physical medium and intelligent consciousness means that any time you have conscious, willfully intending individuals, that will affect the physical medium, and that in turn will affect others.
And the outcome.
And the outcome.
Yes.
Yes. Now, I don't want to get any further than that. Once, I think your listeners will understand, if they sit and think about what I just said, how truly, truly powerful each individual really is.
Yes. Oh, yes. And we are truly powerful beings.
Yes.
The problem is we have not been taught that we are powerful beings.
Well, this is the aspect of this suppressed physics that has been kept out of most of the public's eye.
Yeah.
But it is an aspect that really could not be suppressed anymore once quantum mechanics arrived on the scene, and let me explain why.
Okay.
In quantum mechanics, the fundamental principle that you learn right off the bat is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. All right? And that principle states that velocity and position are conjugate attributes. And what that means is if you set up an experiment to measure the position of an electron, you cannot measure its velocity. And if you set up an experiment to measure its velocity, you cannot measure its position. Okay? Now, if you stop and reflect on what that means even before you perform an experiment, you have made a conscious decision that will determine the outcome of a physical event over which apparently you have no control, just by the way you configure the experiment.
Oh my goodness.
So in other words, at the lowest level of physical reality,
yes,
you know, the level of the subatomic,
yeah,
there is an input mechanism into the universe, into the physical systems of the universe, from consciousness itself. That's what it means. So yeah, if you go now a step further, as I just did when I started on this rabbit trail,
yeah,
if you go a step further and you maintain that there is a direct link between intelligent consciousness and the physical medium itself, not at the level of the subatomic, but beyond even that, if you maintain that, then you realize how very, very powerful consciousness is. You are almost, in a certain sense, to the modern physics equivalent of what the ancient Hindu religion has always taught and maintained, and that is that material reality is an illusion. It's a kind of a hologram.
yeah.
Now, most Westerners, particularly of the religious, you know, Bible-thumping ilk, look at that and say, well, you know, this is just a heresy. This is just nonsense. But they're not understanding what the Hindus are meaning by it, because again, I think with these ancient Hindu texts, you are looking at the residue of a lost science. So in other words, quit thinking of these things as a religious view and look at them as a residue of a lost science.
Yes.
So what they're really saying is, no, the material universe has input mechanisms all over the place for the direct intervention of consciousness into those affairs.
Well, as a man thinketh, so is he. You know, if a group of people think a certain way, they just add to that particular
template. Yes, exactly. This is why I depart company very strongly with those who are into any version of religious-based apocalyptic.
Yes.
Because what they're really playing into is they're setting up a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. Simply
by the way they think.
Yes.
You know, they let a book do their thinking for them rather than their mind and their heart. And, you know, they're setting up their own disaster.
Yes.
Sadly, but this is what they're doing.
Yes.
And again, I don't want to get into all the details of this because they are so profound and they break. I will give this clue for those who have the ears to hear. Once you understand this physics, it breaks all, and I do mean all, without exception. It breaks all of the standard metaphysical categories of philosophy.
Yes.
And of what theologians would call theodicy.
Yeah.
It breaks all of the metaphysical cosmology models that exist, because those things, once you think it through, you discover that the boundaries between those cosmological models are very, very fuzzy. They're not neat and tidy as schoolbook philosophy or schoolbook theology or schoolbook religion or schoolbook history or what have you makes it out to be.
Yeah.
It is so dangerous, and this is the reason I never talk about the details of this. I've only talked about the details of this to maybe at best 5 or 6 people.
Yes.
And those, you know who one of them is.
Yes, I do.
Who has the well, you know actually who more of them than just one of them is, but they have the ability to see certain aspects of this and understand. And one of them's response was, once he saw the math, his response was, "This shatters everything."
Yes.
This shatters everything.
Oh.
And it does. So that's why I never write about it in my books, and I don't talk about it in any detail.
Oh, Joseph, thank you very much for being a part of the Byte Show, and everybody out there that's listening. Joseph needs to move.
Oh boy, yeah.
It's for his own safety.
Yeah.
And he needs to move. And we need to help him do that. There is a PayPal button on his website, GizaDeathStar.com. Please make use of it. Be generous. Yeah. I cannot tell you how important this is.
Yeah, thank you, GeorgeAnn. It's you know the circumstances.
Yes, and, I do.
I am moving, and it's not going to be easy, and I'm under, as you know, some major stress and anxiety.
Yes.
Because of it, so I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And just please go and donate. Joseph needs between $5,000 and $6,000 to do this move, and these audio files are not free. It costs money to do these audio files, phone bills, electricity.
Yes, donate to GeorgeAnn too, please.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. It's very complex. But Joseph does need to move. It is for his own safety. And